millionaire visited a nursing home to make a donation, but ended up shocked to find his mother missing for 40 years, and what she told him made him cry. Leonard Whitfield had everything most people only dream about. He had luxury cars, a house that looked like it belonged in a movie, and a bank account that never seemed to run dry no matter how recklessly he spent. At his age, he already owned one of the largest hotel chains in the country. People looked at him and thought his life was perfect, but Leonard, even though he never said it out loud, carried an old sadness in his heart. A sadness that went all the way back to childhood, back to when he used to ask about his mother, and nobody ever gave him a straight answer, or so he believed. Only his Aunt Rhonda, who had raised him like a second mother, always assured him that his parents had died in a car accident, and that it was better not to stir up those old memories. It was a cloudy Friday afternoon when Leonard decided he wanted to do something different. He didn't want another board meeting or another fancy charity gala. He asked his assistant to find a nursing home they could make a real donation to. Not just any place, but one that genuinely needed the help. That's how he ended up in a rundown part of rural Georgia, outside Savannah, standing in front of Magnolia Manor, an old nursing home with peeling paint and a smell of damp carpet that hit you the moment you stepped inside. Barely had he climbed out of his truck when the facility's director, a short woman with dyed red hair, came rushing out to greet him like he was a celebrity. The plan was simple. Leonard would hand over a check, pose for a photo for the company's social media, and get out of there as fast as possible. But the second he walked through the front door, something shifted. The atmosphere was sad, but there was something else too, something that seemed to pull at his soul from the inside. He walked down the long hallway, past elderly residents sitting in broken-down recliners, some asleep, others staring blankly at a television they didn't seem to understand. And then he saw her. Sitting in a wheelchair near a dirty window was a woman with wild white hair, wrinkled skin, but a look in her eyes that sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. It was as if something deep inside him was screaming that he knew her. He walked over slowly, his hand trembling slightly, which was strange for him, because normally he was a calm, confident man. The woman looked up as if she sensed someone calling her without words. Leonard swallowed hard. She wasn't the best dressed or the best cared for. In fact, she looked like one of the most forgotten residents in the whole building. But there was something about her face, the way she tilted her head, that felt unbearably familiar. The director, noticing his interest, hurried over to explain that the woman's name was Caroline, and that she'd been there for many, many years. She had no family listed in her file, and according to staff, she didn't talk much either. Sometimes she said scattered words, sometimes she just stared into nothing for hours. Leonard asked how she'd ended up there, but the director only shrugged, saying the older records had been destroyed in a flood years back. Leonard didn't know why, but he felt the need to kneel down in front of Caroline. Not to get the photo, not to look good for the cameras. It was something else, something buried deep inside him. When he was face to face with her, Caroline lifted a trembling hand and touched his cheek. Leonard froze. She murmured something almost inaudible, something that sounded to him like his own name. It can't be, he told himself. It can't be. He felt the ground tilt beneath him. The director, nervous, asked if everything was okay. Leonard only nodded, but his mind was in chaos. Suddenly the check didn't matter anymore. Neither did the photos or the charity gala. The only thing that mattered was this woman in front of him. This woman who, even though he couldn't say from where or how, felt like she had been part of his life long before this moment. Without thinking, he pulled out his wallet and handed the director enough cash to make sure the home wouldn't go without for the week, but he refused to take photos. He didn't want anyone posting this online. In his mind, there was only one thought now: find out who Caroline really was. Before leaving, Leonard asked the director if he could come back and visit her. The woman smiled, assuming he was just another guilt-ridden millionaire looking to sponsor an old lady to ease his conscience. Leonard didn't bother correcting her. He simply asked to be allowed back whenever he wanted. Back in his truck, hands sweating on the wheel, Leonard felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear. Fear of what he might find if he kept digging. Fear of discovering that his life, that shiny, perfect life he had built, wasn't built on truth but on old lies. He started the engine but couldn't stop watching the nursing home shrink in his rearview mirror as he drove away. Caroline, that woman lost in her own world, was somehow a missing piece of his own story that had found its way back to him. And Leonard knew he wasn't going to rest until he uncovered the whole truth. Leonard couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was Caroline's face. He didn't understand what was happening to him. He was a practical man, used to making quick decisions without letting emotion get in the way. But now, lying in his enormous bed staring at the ceiling, he felt a hollow ache in his chest that nothing seemed to fill. He got up several times, walked barefoot around the room, went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, but nothing shook that feeling that something was seriously wrong. He grabbed his phone, scrolled through social media, trying to distract himself, but couldn't focus. He turned off the screen and just stared at the black glass. It was as if something inside him was screaming that Caroline wasn't a stranger, that there was more to it, something his mind couldn't quite grasp, but his heart already understood. The next morning, without thinking twice, he got in his truck and drove straight back to Magnolia Manor. He didn't even call ahead. He arrived, knocked, and the director greeted him with a forced smile, clearly not expecting him back so soon. Leonard didn't pay much attention. He just asked to see Caroline. They found her in the same spot by the window. This time, when Leonard approached, Caroline lifted her head faster. She looked at him directly, as if some corner of her mind also recognized something in him. She didn't say a word, but her eyes, those large, clear eyes, spoke in a way words never could. Leonard knelt in front of her again. He didn't know what to say. He didn't want to scare her, so he just smiled and spoke softly. He asked how she was doing, if she remembered anything at all. Caroline didn't answer. She only lifted her trembling hand and touched his cheek again, the same as the day before. That touch, so soft and clumsy, shook his entire soul. He felt like he had lived that exact gesture before, back when he was very small, though he couldn't quite recall it clearly. He sat there in silence for a while as broken images flashed through his mind. A woman's laugh, a sweet perfume, old songs his Aunt Rhonda had never once played for him. Could it possibly be that this woman in front of him was his mother, the same mother everyone had always told him was dead? The director came over, a bit uncomfortable, offering to wheel Caroline out to the courtyard, where there was more light and a small garden. Leonard agreed. He pushed her wheelchair slowly, trying to make the ride smooth. They sat under a tree that barely gave any shade. Out in the open air, Caroline seemed to breathe easier. Her eyes darted back and forth, as if searching for something. Suddenly, she gripped Leonard's hand tight and mumbled a name. He leaned in closer, wanting to hear it clearly. Caroline said, "Leo." Not the whole word, not perfectly clear, but enough. Leonard's heart jumped. Nobody at the nursing home knew his name. Nobody outside his closest circle called him Leo. It was a family nickname, something his Aunt Rhonda used, something only his oldest friends knew. How was it possible that Caroline, this woman lost in her own broken world, knew that name? Questions started flooding Leonard's mind. What if his aunt had lied to him? What if his mother had never actually died? What if she'd been abandoned here to erase her from his life completely? He didn't want to believe it. Rhonda had cared for him his whole life, had raised him, had given him love. But that touch, that look, that whispered name, all of it said something else entirely. He stayed by Caroline's side almost the entire morning, talking to her about nothing in particular, telling her things about his life as if she could understand every word. Caroline didn't say much, but her expression kept shifting. Sometimes she smiled faintly. Sometimes she looked like she wanted to cry. It was as if, inside her, a flood of memories was fighting to break free but couldn't quite make it out. The director came back after a while, looking a little annoyed, to remind him that visiting hours were almost over. Leonard asked for a few more minutes. He couldn't leave, not yet. With the director's permission, he took out his phone and snapped a photo of Caroline. He wanted her face, not just in his memory, but in his pocket too. Something he could look at again and again, in case all of this turned out to be some kind of misunderstanding, some trick his mind was playing on him. As he helped wheel her back to her spot, Caroline looked at him again. No words were needed. Leonard felt like that look was a hug crossing 40 years of silence. He knelt one more time and whispered in her ear that he would come back, that she wasn't alone. He walked out of the nursing home with his chest in pieces. The sun hit his face, but he didn't feel it. He walked slowly to his truck, moving on autopilot. He got in and sat there a long time, keys in hand, not moving a muscle. He knew he had to do something. He had to find out the truth, all of it, no matter how much it hurt. He couldn't keep living without understanding who this woman was, the one now occupying every corner of his mind. He closed his eyes and saw her face again. That face he couldn't and didn't want to forget. Leonard drove without any direction. The city passed by in a blur, and he barely noticed the traffic lights. Everything felt automatic. His mind was caught in a whirlwind of old memories, new questions, and a rage that was only beginning to build inside him. He couldn't understand how nobody had told him the truth in all these years. His entire life had been built on a lie. He got back to his apartment without really remembering the drive, tossed his keys on the entryway table, and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. In his mind, he began digging up things he'd always kept locked away in some dark corner, things he'd preferred not to think about. He remembered being a kid, sitting in the kitchen while his Aunt Rhonda made pancakes. He remembered asking over and over why he didn't have a mom like the other kids. Rhonda always gave the same answer, that there had been a terrible accident involving his mom and dad, that they'd both died together, and that he was too young to remember them. That story, repeated so many times, had become like a tattoo burned into his mind. He'd never dared to question it, until now. He got up and went to an old shoebox he kept in his closet. He'd never really opened it before. Inside were photos, childhood drawings, and a few letters he'd written back when he was just learning to form sentences. Digging through everything, he found a photo that froze the blood in his veins. It was an old, slightly yellowed photograph of himself as a baby in the arms of a woman. The woman had a sweet smile, a simple dress, and long hair that fell like a waterfall. It wasn't Rhonda. With shaking hands, he turned the photo over. On the back, written in rushed handwriting, it said, "Caroline and Leo my whole life." Caroline, the same name as the woman at the nursing home. It couldn't be a coincidence. He sank back onto the couch, the photo clutched tight in his hands. He felt like the floor was opening up beneath him. He had grown up believing his parents were dead, that Rhonda was his only family. But this photo told a different story. It told him his mother had been alive, at least long enough to hold him, to love him, to be his real mother. He remembered other strange things he'd seen as a kid too, documents Rhonda kept locked away, visits from serious-looking men who spoke to her in hushed voices, thinking Leonard couldn't hear. One day he'd overheard the word inheritance, though at the time he hadn't understood what it meant. He only remembered Rhonda's face, tight-lipped and serious, signing papers. Doubt began poisoning his soul. What if Rhonda wasn't the savior he'd always believed her to be? What if she had done terrible things to keep what was never hers? The thought hurt deeply, but he couldn't ignore it. Not after seeing that photo, not after feeling that raw connection with Caroline. He grabbed his phone and called an old contact, Marcus Hale, a private investigator who had once worked for him on a business matter. He wasn't cheap, but Leonard knew Marcus was the type who didn't let go of a case until he'd squeezed out every last truth. They agreed to meet at a diner the next day. He hung up and sat in silence. Suddenly his house felt enormous and empty. All the luxury, the expensive art, the designer furniture, it all looked fake now, like none of it truly belonged to him. He walked to the window and looked out over the city from his penthouse. Out there, life went on as if nothing had happened, as if his whole world wasn't falling apart. He closed his eyes and saw Caroline's face again, that lost, tired look, but full of something he recognized in the deepest part of himself. He knew there was no turning back. What had started as a charity visit had turned into a personal mission, a brutal need to know the truth about his past, about who he really was. He pressed the photo of his mother against his chest and swore he wouldn't rest until he knew everything. No matter what it took, no matter who he had to fight, he was decided. The diner was half empty when Leonard arrived. The place smelled like burnt coffee and cinnamon rolls, but he didn't care. He was too nervous to notice details like that. He sat at a table by the window and waited, his foot bouncing like there was a motor inside him. Marcus Hale showed up right on time, looking the same as always, 2-day stubble, a worn leather jacket, and the kind of face that had seen more ugly things than he cared to talk about. Leonard didn't waste any time. He pulled out the photo of his mother and slid it across the table toward Marcus. The detective looked at it, then looked at Leonard, then looked at the photo again. "What do you need me to find?" he asked in that gravelly voice of his. Leonard explained everything. He talked about the visit to the nursing home, about Caroline, about the connection he felt, about the doubts eating away at his mind. Marcus listened without interrupting, his face serious, like he was already piecing together a puzzle in his head. When Leonard finished, Marcus just said he'd need a couple of days to start working his contacts. They parted ways quickly. Neither of them was the type to sit around making small talk to fill silence. Leonard went home feeling like the clock was moving slower than usual. He spent the entire weekend pacing like a caged animal. He didn't want to see anyone, no parties, no business dinners. He didn't even want to turn on the TV. He just wanted answers. Monday morning, first thing, Marcus called. His voice sounded different, like he'd found something even he hadn't expected. "We need to talk," he said, without giving any more details. They met at the same diner. Marcus arrived with a manila envelope and a face that said bad news. He sat down and pulled out a stack of papers. "I've been digging through old files," he said. "The accident where your parents supposedly died, that part's real. There are official reports, newspaper clippings. All of that checks out," he said, sliding copies across the table. Leonard skimmed through them quickly, recognized his father's and mother's names in the reports, the overturned car, the highway collision, all documented. But something caught his eye. The medical report said the woman had survived the crash, though with serious injuries and confusion. "Confusion?" Leonard asked, feeling his heart nearly leap out of his chest. Marcus nodded. "Yeah. Apparently after the accident, your mother was taken to a rural hospital. She was there a few weeks before disappearing from the system." Leonard felt his hands start to shake. "And nobody asked about her?" "Not officially. According to the records, a woman came to claim her, said she was the only family she had, and checked her out, then had her placed in a nursing home, the same one where you found her." Leonard closed his eyes, trying not to lose control. Everything pointed to Rhonda. Everything. "The name of that woman?" he asked, his voice hard. Marcus dug through the papers and pulled out an old, yellowed form. "Here it is. Name of the person who checked out the patient, Rhonda Whitfield." It hit him like a punch to the gut. Leonard grabbed the paper, gripping it tightly. It was proof enough that his aunt hadn't just lied to him his whole life. She had hidden his mother away, like an old piece of furniture nobody wanted anymore. "That's not all," Marcus said, scratching the back of his neck. "The hospital recorded something else. When your mom woke up from the coma, she barely remembered anything, not her full name, not her address, not her family. The only thing she kept saying, over and over, was Leo." Leonard felt his eyes fill with tears, but he blinked fast to keep them from showing. "Just Leo, nothing else. Yeah, the doctors figured she was just delirious. They never knew she was talking about you." Leonard looked at the photo of his mother, the one he'd carried with him all weekend. Now it all made sense. That gesture at the nursing home, the way she touched his face, that murmur. It wasn't madness. It was her, trying to find him through the fog of her broken mind. He rubbed his face with his hands, a knot in his throat he didn't know how to release. "What are you going to do?" Marcus asked, watching him with curiosity. Leonard didn't answer right away. He carefully put the papers back in the envelope. Like they were pieces of his life he was only just starting to put together. He knew what came next was to go get answers, but it wasn't going to be easy. Rhonda was smart, sharp, and she'd surely do everything she could to keep covering up what she'd done. He stood up from the table, dropped a few bills on the plate, and walked out of the diner without saying another word. He had one goal in his head now, confront Rhonda, and he wasn't going to stop until she told him the whole, absolute truth. Leonard didn't head straight to Rhonda's house. Something in his gut told him he shouldn't confront her without more proof first. If there was one thing he'd learned in all his years in business, it was that you don't fight a war without knowing your enemy first. And right now, as painful as it was to admit, his enemy was his own aunt. He drove first to his childhood home, the house where he'd grown up. It was empty now. He'd kept it out of pure sentiment, though he hadn't really set foot in it in years. He had keys to everything, so he let himself in without trouble. The smell of dust filled his nose. He walked through the hallways in silence, remembering running around as a kid with torn jeans and scraped knees. Everything looked smaller now, sadder. He headed to Rhonda's old office, a small room she used to work in. She'd always been protective of that space. Leonard, as a kid, was never allowed in without permission. Now, as an adult, he didn't need anyone's permission. He started going through drawers, old papers, paid bills, expired insurance contracts. Nothing suspicious at first glance, but something wasn't sitting right. He remembered as a kid seeing Rhonda hide important documents in a secret compartment in the bookshelf. He walked over, ran his hands along the furniture, feeling around. It didn't take long to find a small hidden button in one of the corners. Pressing it revealed a false panel, exposing a built-in safe. Leonard let out a bitter laugh. Of course Rhonda would have a safe. She'd always been suspicious, even of her own shadow. The problem was he didn't know the combination. He sat in front of the safe, thinking. He tried Rhonda's birthday, then his own. Nothing. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and tried a date he could never forget. The date of his parents' accident. The click of the mechanism releasing sounded like thunder in the silent house. He opened the safe with trembling hands. Inside were stacks of old cash, a few pieces of jewelry, and several manila envelopes stacked together. He pulled everything out and laid it on the desk. He started going through the envelopes one by one. Most were property papers, investments, ordinary paperwork for someone who managed money, until he found one that was more crumpled with water stains, simply marked personal. When he opened it, he felt like the world was collapsing on him. There was a copy of his mother's death certificate, but something didn't add up. The date didn't match the records Marcus had found. It was a date before the accident. According to that paper, his mother had died a full year before the car crash. Leonard frowned. He knew that was impossible. That certificate was fake. Next to that document was a power of attorney signed before a notary, naming Rhonda as the sole guardian and administrator of all the Whitfield family assets, claiming there were no other living heirs. There were also old bank statements showing large transfers of money made shortly after the accident, all legally backed, but based on the assumption that both his parents had died without any surviving family. Leonard felt rage, real rage. Rhonda had planned all of it. She'd taken advantage of the accident, of his mother's memory loss, and of her own position as the protective aunt to steal everything that wasn't hers. Not just money, not just property. She had stolen his life, stolen the chance to grow up with his real mother. Among the papers, he found an old letter. It was from his mother. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It read more like something she'd written just to get things off her chest. In the letter, Caroline talked about her fear. She said she'd had a bad feeling before the trip, that Rhonda had changed a lot in recent months, that she wasn't the same person anymore, that she'd started to distrust her, but didn't know how to confront it without proof. Leonard gripped the paper between his fingers. It was like hearing his mother's voice reaching out from the past, warning him about what was happening. He put everything back in the envelope and tucked it into his bag. He closed the safe, put the panel back the way it was, and walked out of the office without making a sound, even though there was nobody around to hear him. Climbing into his truck, he felt his blood boiling. It was a cold, calculated fury. He wasn't going to make a scene, wasn't going to yell or cry in front of Rhonda. He was going to use those papers as a weapon. He was going to force her to tell him the truth, the whole truth. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was hard, his eyes sharp. He was no longer the same Leonard who had walked into that nursing home just wanting to do something good. He was a man at war. He started the engine and drove straight toward Rhonda's house. It was time to face her one-on-one. Rhonda lived in a big house in an upscale neighborhood, surrounded by well-kept gardens and tall trees. Leonard parked his truck right in front of the main entrance. He turned off the engine. He sat there a moment, gripping the wheel tightly, as if gathering all his energy just to keep from exploding right then and there. Then he let out a sharp breath, grabbed the manila envelope from the passenger seat, and got out. He rang the doorbell, waited. Nothing. He rang again, harder this time. He heard footsteps approaching. Then the door opened. Rhonda appeared, impeccable as always, in a tailored dress, her pearl necklace, and that pleasant expression she'd always used to handle him since he was a boy. "Leo, what a surprise," she said, smiling. "What are you doing here so early?" Leonard didn't smile back. He didn't say anything, just held up the envelope in his hand. "We need to talk," he said, his voice dry. Rhonda's brow furrowed for a second, but she stepped aside to let him in. Leonard walked in, the smell of scented candles filling his nose. The house was tidy, clean as always, but now all that order felt fake to him, just like her. They sat in the living room facing each other. He didn't waste time, pulled out the copy of the fake death certificate and set it on the table. "What is this, Rhonda?" he asked, staring straight into her eyes. She looked down, just for a second, only a second. Then she looked back at him with that same smile she'd always used to calm him down. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said calmly. Leonard let out a short, bitter laugh. "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You signed papers. You made everyone believe my mom was dead when she wasn't." Rhonda crossed her legs slowly, as if she wasn't in any hurry, as if she had everything under control. "Leonard, sweetheart, you were a baby. You don't know everything that happened back then. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of pain. I did the best I could to protect you." Leonard clenched his fists. "Protect me? Putting my mom in a forgotten nursing home and keeping the family's money for yourself was protecting me?" For the first time, Rhonda's smile trembled a little. Not much, but enough for Leonard to notice. "It was best for you," she said, almost in a whisper, but firm. "Your mom wasn't well. She didn't remember anything. She was a danger to you, to everyone." Leonard leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And you decided the best thing was to make her disappear, lock her away like an old piece of furniture, and live off money that wasn't yours." Rhonda clicked her tongue, annoyed. "It wasn't like that. I raised you. I gave you everything you needed. Don't judge me now that you're a grown man. You don't know the decisions a person has to make to survive." Leonard shook his head, feeling his blood boil. "It wasn't your decision to make. You had no right." Rhonda looked at him straight on. For a second, the mask slipped. Her expression hardened, turned cold. "You're right," she said, her voice sharp. "I didn't have the right, but I did it because if I hadn't, that woman would have dragged you down into her madness. And everything we built, the whole fortune, the life you have now, none of it would exist." Leonard leaned back, feeling like he'd been slapped. "We built," he repeated. "You built it. I was just a kid." Rhonda smiled again, but this time there was venom in it. "I'm the one who kept everything standing while you grew up like a prince. You don't just owe me your upbringing, you owe me your success, your place in this world." Leonard stood up abruptly. He couldn't listen to her anymore. "What you gave me doesn't make up for what you took from me," he said, his voice cracking with rage. Rhonda stood up too, smoothing her dress. "And what are you going to do, Leonard? Are you going to destroy the only family you have left over some crazy old woman who doesn't even recognize you?" Leonard looked at her with deep sadness. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was disappointment. It was realizing that all the admiration, all the affection he'd ever felt for her had just been another lie. "I'm not alone," he said, walking toward the door. "She's my real family, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to give her back her life." Rhonda didn't answer. She stood frozen in the middle of the living room, watching him leave, her face hard as stone. Leonard slammed the door on his way out. He walked to his truck feeling like he'd crossed a point of no return. Nothing would ever be the same again, but he didn't care. It was time to take back what had been stolen from him. Leonard drove around for a while with no destination, just trying to clear his head. But the rage wouldn't die down. He felt like he was carrying fire in his chest. Everything he'd believed about his family, his whole life, was crumbling, and worse, he knew there was still so much more to uncover. He parked on a quiet street and called Marcus Hale. He didn't want to wait any longer. He needed answers, proof, anything he could use against Rhonda to clear his mother's name and, in the process, recover some of what she had taken. Marcus answered quickly, like he'd been expecting the call too. "What do you have?" Leonard asked, straight to the point. "Better come to the office." I can't lay it all out over the phone, the detective said. Leonard started the truck and within 30 minutes he was parking in front of the small building where Marcus ran his agency. It was a simple place, the kind where the desks are old, the lamps flicker and the chairs creak. Marcus greeted him with a cup of coffee in hand and a face like he hadn't slept properly in days. "Come on in," he said, waving him over. Leonard walked in, sat down and set the manila envelope on the desk like a shield. Marcus sat across from him, pulled a thick folder from a drawer and set it on the table. "I've been digging deeper into the accident records, but also into your aunt's financial movements. Wasn't easy. Rhonda's smart and knows how to cover her tracks, but she's not perfect." Leonard stared at him like a hawk ready to strike. "I found something big," Marcus said, opening the folder. Shortly after the accident, Rhonda moved several properties into her own name. Some sales were clean, others not so much. Leonard grabbed the papers and started reading. There were copies of deeds, bank transfers, sales of land and houses that had originally belonged to his father. "How did she pull this off?" Leonard asked, his voice tight. "With forged documents," Marcus explained. "She had your mother declared dead, and you registered as a minor with no direct inheritance. That made her the sole legal heir." Leonard felt like every word was a punch to the gut. "But that's not all," Marcus said, pulling out another sheet. It was a report from an investigator working in another state. According to the report, there were witnesses who remembered Rhonda showing up at the hospital after the accident, insisting on taking Caroline, signing papers, and giving false information. A retired nurse recalls that Caroline didn't want to leave with her. She was confused, but every time she saw Rhonda she got nervous, agitated, like she sensed something wasn't right. Leonard clenched his teeth. He pictured his mother alone, hurt, confused, and on top of that, forced to leave with someone who only wanted to make her disappear. "And the nursing home?" he asked, wanting to know everything. Marcus nodded. "The place they put your mom in was low quality, chosen on purpose, a cheap place where nobody would ask too many questions. The director from back then died years ago, but I managed to track down a former nurse who worked there. She remembers a young woman bringing in an injured woman, saying she was a distant aunt, paid several months in advance, left a fake phone number, and disappeared." Leonard closed his eyes, feeling the anger tighten around his chest like a claw. "Can the nurse testify?" he asked. Marcus shrugged. "She says she can. She doesn't hold a grudge, but she doesn't want trouble either. Though if we pay for her time and guarantee her protection, she might be willing to state what she knows." Leonard stood up from his chair, pacing the office. His mind was racing the way it did when he was closing an important business deal. "We need more," he said. "Something that brings her down for good, not just words. We need hard evidence." Marcus smiled sideways. "That's why I called you. I found something else." He pulled out a copy of an old bank record. "After your mom was admitted, Rhonda moved a bank account that was in your parents' names. She closed it and transferred the money to an account of her own in the Cayman Islands, all through a lawyer who, funny enough, now works for her as legal counsel." Leonard stared at him. "You have the lawyer's name?" Marcus nodded. "Stephen Wardell, and trust me, that guy's worse than a shark." Leonard knew he had to act fast. If Rhonda suspected they were closing in, she could destroy evidence, move money, shut every door. "Can you keep digging?" Leonard asked. "Of course," Marcus answered. "But we're going to need more people. This isn't some simple job anymore. We're up against someone who spent her whole life learning how to move without getting caught." Leonard reached into his pocket and pulled out his card. "Do whatever you have to do," he said, "but bring me everything, down to the last thing she's hiding." Marcus took the card, tucked it into his jacket, and reached out his hand. "Deal, but brace yourself. This is just getting started." Leonard shook his hand firmly. He knew there was no turning back now. Leonard wasn't the type to back down when things got ugly. In fact, that's when he got even stronger. That same night, after seeing everything Marcus had shown him, he decided he couldn't keep waiting for things to resolve themselves. That wasn't his style. He went back to his apartment, but not to rest. He locked himself in his study, closed the door, turned off his phone so nobody would bother him, and pulled out every document he'd gathered so far. He spread them across the big wooden table like pieces of a puzzle. The fake certificate, the transfers, the property papers, all of it. Each page was a dirty piece of the story Rhonda had written for her own benefit. Next to all that, he placed a folder he'd always kept in his personal safe. It was a package his father had left with his lawyer, with instructions to hand it to Leonard when he turned 30. He'd received it right on time, of course, but back then he hadn't given it much thought. He'd been too busy growing his businesses, and he'd left the papers stored away without ever really looking through them. Now, knowing what he knew, those papers might hold answers he never imagined. He opened the folder carefully. The first thing he found was a letter handwritten by his father. "Leo, if you're reading this, it means you've grown into a man. I trust you'll know how to take care of everything we built with so much effort. Always remember where you came from." Leonard felt a lump form in his throat, but he kept reading. Inside the folder were copies of all the family's assets, hotels, land, bank accounts, all in his father's name, some jointly owned with his mother. There was also a will. In the will, his father left everything to his wife, Caroline, first, and if anything happened to her, it would pass directly to his son, Leonard. It said nothing about Rhonda, not a single word. Leonard clenched his jaw. There it was, solid proof that Rhonda had no right to any of it. Everything she'd managed all those years wasn't hers. It belonged to his mother first, and to him after. He kept looking and found something else, a typed letter, signed by a trusted family lawyer, confirming that in the event both of Leonard's parents died, a trust was to be opened in Leonard's name to protect the inheritance until he came of age. But that trust had never been opened. Rhonda had done everything possible to prevent it, forging documents, manipulating lawyers, posing as the only living relative, all to keep the fortune for herself. Leonard felt his blood boil in his veins. He leaned back in the chair, breathing hard, forcing down the urge to march over to Rhonda's door right then and scream in her face everything he'd discovered. But he knew he had to be smart. If he wanted to get back what was his and get justice for his mother, he had to do it right, step by step with solid proof, with the law on his side. So he picked up the phone and called Marcus. "I need you to find me a lawyer," he said the second he heard Marcus's voice. "A good one who knows how to fight dirty when it's necessary." Marcus didn't ask for details. "Leave it to me," he answered, and hung up. Leonard spent the rest of the night organizing everything. He made copies of every document, sorted everything into folders, built a case file like he was preparing to present it in front of a judge, because he knew that was exactly what he was about to do. By dawn, he had everything ready. He showered, put on a simple dark suit and headed straight to a notary. He needed the documents certified, needed to make sure everything he had could be used legally in his counterattack. While the notary reviewed the papers, Leonard stared out the window. The city was starting to move, people coming and going, oblivious to everything happening in his world. He thought about his mother, about everything she had lost, not just her comfortable life, her house, her family. She'd also lost the chance to watch her son grow up, to hug him on his birthdays, to be there for his wins and his losses. He thought about everything Rhonda had stolen from him, not just money, but an entire life. And he knew he wasn't going to stop until he got justice. Hours passed between paperwork and signatures. When he finished, he got a text from Marcus. He'd found the perfect lawyer, a young guy, but sharp as a tack, specialized in inheritance disputes and family fraud cases. Leonard smiled for the first time in days. Finally, the pieces were starting to move in his favor. He knew the next step was to face not just Rhonda, but her whole world of influence, dirty lawyers and legal traps. But he didn't care. He was ready. Leonard arrived right on time for the meeting Marcus had arranged. It was a law office on a high floor of a downtown tower, all glass and steel, where the air smelled like expensive coffee and success. He rode up to the 20th floor, and the moment he walked in, he saw Marcus waiting for him in the lobby. Marcus didn't say anything, just motioned for him to follow. The lawyer's name was Richard Cole, 35 years old, impeccable suits, and a gaze that seemed to read people in seconds. When Leonard walked into his office, Richard stood up, shook his hand firmly and invited him to sit. "Marcus filled me in a little on the situation," Richard said, pulling out a notepad. "You have the documents?" Leonard nodded and laid everything out on the table. The deeds, the will, the powers of attorney, the fake certificates, everything in order. Richard reviewed each paper patiently, making small notes here and there. He didn't talk much, just occasionally frowned or nodded, as if everything he was reading confirmed what he already suspected. After nearly an hour of silence, he looked up. "Your aunt committed fraud, and not a small one. Forgery of documents, identity theft, fraudulent management of someone else's estate. If this gets presented in court, she could go to prison for a long time." Leonard clenched his fists, but forced himself to stay calm. "What do I need to do?" "First, we need more living proof," Richard said. "Witnesses, people who can confirm your mother was alive when your aunt made her disappear, and that you can prove all the money, all the properties, were moved through deception." Marcus jumped in. "I already tracked down a nurse from the nursing home and also a hospital worker who treated Caroline after the accident. Both remember important details. If we can get them to testify, we're halfway there." Leonard nodded, determined. "Bring them in." Richard gave a nod. "And one more thing, we need to find original documents, not just copies. That strengthens your case. The original deeds, the account certificates, anything you can get your hands on." Leonard thought fast. He remembered that at his father's old office, closed up since he was a boy, there might be more documents stored away. The property was still in the family's name, and even though he hadn't wanted to go back there since the accident, now he had no choice. He stood up from his chair. "I'll go find them." Marcus offered to come along, but Leonard shook his head. "This one I have to do alone." He left the office and drove straight toward the old ranch where he'd grown up, a few hours outside the city. Along the way, his head spun with thoughts. He thought about his mother, about his childhood, about the lies he'd swallowed his whole life without even knowing it. When he arrived, the ranch looked just like he remembered: the rusted gate, the dirt road full of stones, the big house with peeling paint. He pushed open the front door, which creaked like it was groaning from the years of neglect. He walked straight to his father's office. It was locked, but the old wood didn't hold up when he pushed hard. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The furniture, the paintings, the bookshelves full of books. The air smelled like humidity and dead memories. He started searching, opened drawers, checked under furniture, took paintings off the walls, until he found an old built-in safe beneath a worn-out rug on the floor. Another combination. He closed his eyes and thought, what code would his father have used? He tried his own birth date. Nothing. Tried his parents' anniversary. Nothing. He sat down on the floor, frustrated, until he remembered something. A conversation from when he was a kid. His father had told him his favorite number was the day his mother was born, April 7th, 0407. He entered the combination. The safe clicked open. Inside he found several sealed envelopes, original property deeds, hotel ownership titles, bank account contracts, all in his parents' names. But what caught his attention most was a separate envelope with his name written on the front, for Leonard, when the time comes. He opened it with trembling hands. It was a letter. "Leo, if you ever doubt who you are or where you come from, you'll find your truth here. Your mother and I loved you more than anything in this world. If you're reading this, something probably happened to us. Don't blindly trust anyone, son. Even family can fail you. Trust your heart. Dad." Leonard felt his chest tighten. He packed all the documents into his bag, closed the safe again, and walked out of the office. He knew he now had everything he needed to prove that Rhonda had built her whole life on a mountain of lies, but he also knew the hardest part still remained: getting his mother out of that nursing home and helping her reclaim, even just a piece, of the life that had been stolen from her. Leonard didn't waste any time. As soon as he got back to the city, he met with Richard and Marcus and handed over all the original documents he'd found at the ranch. The excitement barely fit inside him, but he also felt that same tension in his chest, like something was telling him the worst was still ahead. Richard reviewed every paper with that calm demeanor of his that sometimes drove people crazy, and finished putting together the full case file. They had everything now: witnesses, original documents, bank records, Jack Whitfield's real will, and even the personal letter. "We're ready," Richard said, closing the folder firmly. Leonard nodded. The time had come to close in on Rhonda. They summoned her to Richard's office. It wasn't easy. Rhonda didn't respond right away to calls or emails. She went dark for a few days, but Marcus, who was a bloodhound when it came to finding people, managed to track her down. Someone spotted her leaving a luxury spa and then entering a house in another exclusive neighborhood he didn't even know she owned. The pressure worked. Rhonda agreed to meet, but she set conditions. No cameras, no recordings, just a civilized conversation, as she put it herself. Leonard arrived first at the office along with Richard and Marcus. He didn't want to make any mistakes. When Rhonda walked in, she looked impeccable. A pearl-colored tailored suit, perfect makeup, and that same smile she always used to manipulate everyone around her. But in her eyes, there was something different this time. Not fear, defiance, wounded pride. "Leo," she said as she sat down across from him, "how sad that it's come to this after everything I did for you." Leonard didn't take the bait. Richard placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly. "Ms. Whitfield," the lawyer said in a firm voice, "we're here because we have clear evidence that you committed fraud, forged documents, and stripped Caroline Whitfield, Leonard's legitimate mother, of her assets and her freedom." Rhonda let out a dry laugh. "Proof, please. All of that's just old paperwork. Nothing a good lawyer can't explain away in court." Leonard looked at her, feeling a mix of sadness and rage. "I don't want to take this to trial," he said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "I just want you to return what isn't yours. I want to clear my mother's name. I want you to face what you did." Rhonda looked at him with contempt. "Do you really think you're going to destroy me that easily, after all the power I've built over the years?" "No, my dear Leo, it's not that simple." Richard slid copies of the bank transfers toward her. "This is money laundering, ma'am. Transfers to offshore accounts, enough for the IRS and the district attorney's office to start investigating you." Rhonda glanced at the papers without flinching. "You've got nothing solid. A letter, an old will, witnesses who barely remember anything. I'm not scared." Leonard took a deep breath. "And what about the fact that my mother is alive, that she can recognize you, that she mutters my name every time she sees me for just an instant, just one instant?" He saw the tremble in Rhonda's lips, the first crack in her steel facade, but she recovered quickly. "Your mother's out of her mind. You think her testimony means anything? Nobody's going to believe a poor old woman who can't even remember her own last name." Marcus smiled sideways, almost amused. "She doesn't need to remember everything. We have medical records proving that after the accident she was alive, conscious, and that you had her committed to a nursing home without being her legal guardian." Rhonda clenched her jaw. She wasn't the calm woman who had walked into the office anymore. Now she was a cornered animal. "And what do you want, Leonard?" She spat the words, her eyes blazing with fury. "Do you want to humiliate me? Send me to prison? Ruin me publicly?" Leonard didn't hesitate. "I want justice. I want my mother to get back what's hers. I want all of America to know who you really are." Rhonda stood up from her chair so abruptly she almost knocked it over. "You don't know who you're messing with," she said, lowering her voice into something threatening. "You don't know the power I have. I'm not going to just sit back and take this." Richard adjusted his glasses without losing his composure. "It's a little late for threats, ma'am. You have two options. Reach a settlement right now or face a criminal process you won't be able to control." Rhonda looked at him like she wanted to kill him with her eyes. Then she turned to Leonard. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Leo." He held her gaze without fear. "I already made the mistake of trusting you. I'm not going to make it twice." Rhonda grabbed her purse, slapped the folder of documents off the table, and stormed out of the office without saying goodbye. The door slammed shut with a sound like thunder rolling through the room. Leonard sank back into his chair, feeling the weight of years and years of lies crashing down on him all at once. "She's going to fight this with everything she's got," Richard said seriously. "Get ready for a dirty war." Leonard nodded, clenching his fists. He was ready for anything. Leonard didn't want to wait any longer. After the confrontation with Rhonda, he understood that the most important piece of all this was Caroline. Fragile as she was the living proof of everything that had happened, and he wasn't going to keep letting her stay in that forgotten nursing home. That same afternoon he drove straight there. He didn't call ahead, didn't ask for an appointment. He arrived, got out of his truck, and pushed through the rusty gate in one motion. The director, the same red-haired woman who had greeted him the first time, ran to intercept him. "Mr. Whitfield, I told you visits need to be scheduled." Leonard didn't let her finish. "I'm not here to visit," he said, looking at her directly. "I'm here to take my mother home." The director opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She just followed him as he strode down the long, damp hallway. He found Caroline in the same spot as always, sitting by the dirty window, staring into nothing. But this time something was different. When Leonard approached, Caroline blinked several times, as if she recognized his presence, as if something inside her was slowly switching on. He knelt in front of her and took her hands. "Mum," he said, using the word for the first time without fear. "You're not alone anymore. I'm going to take care of everything. You're coming with me." Caroline looked at him. Her lips trembled. She didn't say clear words, but her eyes filled with tears. Leonard felt his heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. He didn't ask permission. He called a private doctor he'd already hired, and within an hour, Caroline was being transferred to a private clinic, a clean, modern place full of light, with doctors who genuinely cared about their patients. That's where a new chapter began. The doctors ran tests, scans, neurological exams, diagnosis, moderate cognitive damage from the accident, and from years of neglect, but with a chance for partial recovery with the right treatment. Stimulation therapy, medication, constant care. Leonard didn't hesitate for a second. He accepted all of it. Money didn't matter to him. If there was even the smallest chance his mother could get back some piece of her life, he was going to fight for it. Difficult days followed. There were moments when Caroline didn't remember anything. Moments when she got scared. Moments when she got lost in her own world. Leonard never left her side. He went with her to every therapy session, read to her, talked to her like she could understand every word, as if her mind just needed a small push to reconnect. One day, while they were sitting in the clinic's garden, Caroline gripped his hand tight. "Leo," she murmured, barely audible. Leonard knelt down fast without letting go of her hand. "I'm here, Mom, don't worry. Everything's going to be okay." Caroline looked at him, and in her eyes there was something he hadn't seen in weeks. It was like, after all this time, a part of her had finally woken up. "My boy," she said, her voice broken but clear. Leonard felt a lump form in his throat so big he could barely breathe. He hugged her tight, with a desperate tenderness, as if trying to protect her from lost time, from the pain, from all the years they never got to share. Caroline cried, and her tears fell silently onto the grey sweater the clinic had given her. That was the first big step. The doctors were amazed. They said it was a huge breakthrough, that she was starting to recognize faces, trying to form words, showing strong emotions. Leonard never left her side. He brought her photos from when he was a kid, songs his mother used to sing to him as a baby, soft perfumes he thought might help awaken old memories. Little by little, Caroline started improving. It wasn't like flipping a switch and fixing everything, but every small step forward was a victory, a shy smile, a loose word, a direct look. One afternoon, sitting in the garden, Caroline took his hand again. "My house?" she asked, her voice shaky. Leonard looked at her, surprised. "You want to go home, Mum?" he asked, his voice full of emotion. Caroline nodded with effort. Leonard felt like crying again, but he held it in. He stroked her hand and promised her that very soon they'd have a home together again. Not in that old house where so many lies had been woven, but somewhere new, clean, full of truth. That day he understood that even though his mother didn't remember everything, her heart still knew exactly where it belonged. The next step was getting her out of the clinic, setting her up in a real home and continuing to fight for her recovery. But he also knew he couldn't let his guard down. Rhonda was still out there, and if she'd proven anything, it was that she wasn't going to give up easily. Leonard looked at his mother, so fragile but so brave, and clenched his jaw. The war was just getting started. It was a Sunday, and the weather couldn't quite decide if it wanted to rain or clear up. Leonard had brought Caroline out to the clinic's courtyard like he did almost every day. It was their routine, giving her some sun, talking to her about little things, trying to coax out some gesture, some word. He wasn't in a rush. He had all the patience in the world for her. They sat under a tree with a blanket over Caroline's legs because the air was a little chilly. Leonard talked to her softly, telling her about the plants, about the cars passing by in the distance. Sometimes she responded with a faint smile, sometimes she just stared. That day, while he showed her an old photo of himself as a kid riding a little toy horse, Caroline's brow furrowed, like something inside her had shifted. Leonard watched her closely. "You remember this, Mom?" he asked, holding the photo closer. Caroline raised a trembling hand and touched it gently with her fingertips, like it was something sacred. She murmured something Leonard didn't quite catch. He leaned in to hear better. "What did you say?" Caroline whispered, almost like a sigh. "The palms," she said. Leonard froze. "What?" "The palms." She nodded slowly, like even that small effort of remembering cost her something. "Ranch." "The palms," she repeated, a little more clearly. Leonard felt a chill run down his spine. That name didn't mean anything to him in his current life, but it was clear it meant something important to Caroline. It wasn't some random word. It was like a spark in her mind. He pulled out his phone and searched Palm Ranch quickly. Several results came up, but one caught his eye, an old ranch on the outskirts of the state, abandoned, registered under the Whitfield family name for many years. His father had bought that ranch before the accident, back when they dreamed of having a place to get away from the city. Leonard had never been there as a kid. His Aunt Rhonda always said the place was dangerous, too far, not worth the trip. Now he understood why they'd never taken him there. He looked at Caroline again. She was looking at him too, with that same mix of sadness and hope. "You want us to go there?" he asked, stroking her hand. Caroline nodded. It wasn't a big movement, but it was clear. Leonard felt his heart pound so hard his ears started ringing. He knew he couldn't bring her there right now. She was too fragile, needed constant medical care. But he could go. He promised her quietly that he would go, that he would find whatever it took to understand what had happened. He stayed with her a while longer, talking, giving her comfort. When Caroline fell asleep, peaceful under the tree, Leonard knew he couldn't waste any time. That same afternoon he met with Marcus. He explained everything, Caroline's memory, the name of the ranch, the connection to his past. Marcus lit up just like he had. If she remembered that, it's because something important happened there, the detective said, adjusting his worn-out cap. Leonard nodded. "We have to go." Marcus didn't hesitate for a second. Tomorrow. That night, Leonard barely slept. He spent it going over everything he knew, connecting the dots in his head. What was at that ranch? Why did Caroline, even lost in her broken memories, remember that place? What secrets was Rhonda trying to bury forever there? At dawn, he met Marcus at a mechanic's shop. The detective had found an old truck, one of those rugged off-road ones, because they knew getting to the ranch meant crossing some rough terrain. "Ready for the end of the world," Marcus joked, but his smile was serious. Leonard smiled too, though not out of amusement. Ready for anything. They set off. Along the way, the landscape kept changing. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt paths surrounded by dry brush. The heat grew heavier. Dust crept in through the windows, and every pothole shook them like the truck might fall apart. But they didn't stop. After nearly 4 hours on the road, they finally saw it. The ranch. Off in the distance, in the middle of nowhere, stood the old structure. It was a massive building with grey stone walls covered in vines and overgrowth. It looked like a ghost from another era. Leonard got out of the truck, staring at everything with a knot in his stomach. He knew he was about to discover something big, something that could change everything. The truck came to a stop in front of an old wooden gate, rotting and barely hanging from a rusted hinge. Leonard got out first. The air smelled like dry earth, old dampness, abandonment. The ranch stood there, massive, silent, almost daring them to come inside. Marcus pulled a flashlight from his bag, even though it was still daytime. He didn't trust old places like this, and neither did Leonard. Something about the atmosphere felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding secrets they didn't want found. They pushed the gate open carefully. It shrieked so loudly that birds flew off from the nearby trees. They walked slowly through a courtyard overrun with weeds. The ground was cracked with puddles of mud and loose stones. Every step kicked up dust. They reached the main door of the house. It was large, made of solid wood, though half falling apart. Leonard pushed hard and it swung open, releasing a cloud of dust that made them both cough. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. The high ceiling let in shafts of light filtering through broken beams. There was old furniture covered in dirty sheets, crooked paintings on the walls, and broken glass scattered everywhere. "You sure you want to keep going?" Marcus asked, looking around warily. Leonard nodded without hesitation. "There's something here. I can feel it." They started exploring the place. First they passed through a large living room, then a long dining room with a table that still had broken plates on top, as if someone had gotten up in the middle of dinner and never came back. They reached what looked like a library. Books scattered across the floor, old papers strewn about. Leonard walked slowly, paying attention to every detail. Suddenly Marcus called him over from a corner. "Look at this." Leonard walked over. Marcus had found a trapdoor in the floor, half hidden under an old rug. They looked at each other without a word. Leonard grabbed the edge of the trapdoor and pulled hard. The wood creaked but gave way. Underneath, a staircase led down into a dark basement. Leonard swallowed hard. "Let's go." They turned on their flashlights and went down slowly. The air was cold and smelled like mold. The stairs creaked like they might collapse. Downstairs, the basement was large, full of dusty boxes, decaying shelves, and furniture covered in torn plastic sheets. Leonard walked straight toward one of the biggest boxes, opened it, and found old papers, photo albums, documents inside. He started flipping through photos of his father as a young man, of his mother smiling at some party, of himself as a baby, all forgotten there, as if someone had wanted to erase those memories forever. But there was something else. At the bottom of the box he found a blue folder sealed with yellow tape. He tore it open and pulled out the papers. It was a record, a medical report on his mother, dated days after the accident, and in it a handwritten note. Patient transferred at the request of family member Rhonda Whitfield. No diagnosis of permanent incapacity, only partial memory loss. Psychological treatment recommended, not institutionalization. Leonard felt his chest tighten. His mother hadn't been crazy. She'd only lost part of her memory. And Rhonda, knowing that, had decided to lock her away in a nursing home forever. "Here it is," Leonard murmured, showing Marcus the document. The detective read it in silence. Then he clicked his tongue in fury. "With this, Rhonda can't wiggle out of it." Leonard put the folder in his bag, but something else caught his attention. In a corner of the basement, almost hidden among broken furniture, there was a small door, the kind meant for storing tools. He walked over, opened it slowly. The flashlight lit up a tiny, nearly empty space, except for something on the floor. A car, or what was left of one. It was a rusted chassis crushed by the years, covered in dust and cobwebs. But Leonard recognized the shape instantly, the color, the emblem. It was his parents' car. Marcus walked over, stunned. What the hell is this doing here? Leonard couldn't believe it. They'd always been told the car had been destroyed in the accident, that it was totaled, sent to a scrapyard. But no, here it was, hidden in the basement of the ranch. He got closer and saw something that froze him. The passenger seat was intact, and there on the floor, half covered in dirt, he found a silver pendant, a small heart engraved with the initials C and J. Caroline and Jack, his parents. He gripped the pendant in his hand. "Something happened here," he said quietly. "Something Rhonda wanted to hide." Marcus nodded. "And now she can't hide it anymore." Leonard put the pendant in his pocket, closed the bag with the papers and the medical report, and took one last look at the abandoned car. He knew he'd found a key piece, but he also knew this only made Rhonda more dangerous. She wasn't going to fall without a fight, and neither was he. When Leonard and Marcus walked out of the ranch, the sun was already setting. The sky was a mix of orange and purple, and the wind kicked up clouds of dust behind them. They climbed into the truck in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. They didn't need to say it out loud. What they'd found was huge, big enough to finally put Rhonda against the ropes for good. But Marcus, who always thought one step ahead, wasn't satisfied yet. "We're missing something," he said, starting the engine. "Proof, sure, But we also need a witness, somebody who can confirm what happened at this ranch. Leonard glanced at him sideways, understanding instantly. You think somebody saw something? Marcus let out a dry laugh. In small towns, everybody knows everything. There's always somebody who saw, who heard, who remembers something. We just have to find them. They didn't waste any time. They drove down to the nearest small town, about 15 minutes from the ranch. It was a tiny place. Cobblestone streets, low-roofed houses, and people who eyed you strangely if you weren't from around there. They parked in front of a little general store that barely looked like it was standing. Marcus, who was good at talking to all kinds of people, went in first. Leonard followed. Inside, an older woman worked behind the counter. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her hands showed years of hard work. When she saw them, she narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "Afternoon, ma'am," Marcus greeted her with a smile. "We're here on behalf of the Whitfield family. We're looking for anyone who used to work at the old ranch out there years back." The woman looked them over like she was weighing them. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, her voice dry. Leonard stepped forward. "It's important, ma'am. We want to know what really happened out there. My mother went through something terrible, and we think somebody might be able to help us." The woman stayed quiet for a few seconds, then adjusted her apron and came out from behind the counter. "Come with me," she said simply. She led them to the back of the store, where there was a small room full of old photos on the walls. She pointed to one in particular, a group of smiling men in front of the ranch. "My husband worked out there," she said. "His name was Roger. He was the ranch foreman for years, until they shut everything down out of nowhere one day." Leonard felt his heart pound harder. "Is he still alive?" The woman nodded. "He's alive, but he's sick. He barely gets out of bed. If you want to see him, it's at your own risk. He doesn't like to talk much." Leonard didn't hesitate. "We want to see him." The woman pointed them to a house at the end of the street. It was an old building with crumbling walls and a wooden fence that had fallen apart in pieces. They knocked on the door and waited. After a moment, a young woman opened it. She must have been the granddaughter, around 18 or 20, looking at them with the same suspicion as everyone else in town. When they explained why they'd come, she hesitated a few seconds, but finally let them in. The house was humble, with old furniture and a smell of dampness that hit you the moment you walked in. In a bed by the window, tucked under a thick blanket, lay Roger, a man thin as a rail, his face weathered by the sun and the years. Leonard approached slowly. "Mr. Dunlap, my name is Leonard Whitfield. I've come to ask you about the ranch, about what happened 40 years ago." Roger opened his eyes with difficulty. He looked at them with a mix of curiosity and resignation. "Whitfield," he murmured. "That name carries weight, son." Leonard knelt beside his bed. "My mother, Caroline, she remembers you." The old man let out a long sigh. "Of course I remember her. She was a good woman, always smiling, always looking out for everybody." Leonard swallowed hard. "What happened that day?" "The day of the accident." Roger looked up at the ceiling like he was searching for the words in the water stains. "I saw everything," he finally said, his voice rough. "I saw when your aunt showed up. That woman, Rhonda, arrived nervous, with a half-destroyed car. Your mom was inside, alive but confused, out of it. She was asking for her son, asking for you." Leonard clenched his fists, holding back the rage. "And my father?" The old man closed his eyes. "He was already gone. I saw it. Rhonda didn't want to wait for anybody. She told me not to say a word, that if I talked I'd be in serious trouble. Then she just took your mom away. No papers, no telling anyone." Leonard felt his stomach turn. "Are you willing to testify?" he asked, knowing it was a lot to ask. Roger smiled sadly. "Son, I don't know how much time I've got left, but if I can help make things right, I'll do it. Not for you, for her, for your mother." Leonard squeezed his hand with gratitude. He knew that testimony could change everything. When they walked out of the house, the sky was already dark. All they could hear were crickets and the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel. Marcus lit a cigarette and blew the smoke out slowly. "We've got Caroline, we've got the documents, and now we've got a key witness." Leonard looked up at the starry sky. "Now it's your turn, Rhonda. You're out of lies." The following days were pure strategy. Richard prepared the documents for the district attorney's office. Marcus arranged the witnesses. Leonard spent every free moment he could with his mother. It was like each of them was playing their part in a game they already knew there was no turning back from. Rhonda, meanwhile, had disappeared. Nobody knew where she was. She wasn't answering calls, wasn't showing up at any of her houses. Not even her closest friends knew where she'd gone. Leonard wasn't fooled. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. Rhonda was maneuvering, looking for a way to save herself, and it didn't take long for her to make her move. One afternoon, Richard called Leonard urgently. "We've got a problem." Leonard was at the clinic with Caroline when he got the call. He stepped out into the hallway quickly to hear better. What happened? Rhonda filed a countersuit. She's claiming all the money and the properties are legitimately hers, and she's accusing Caroline of having been mentally incapacitated even before the accident. Leonard gripped the phone so hard he almost cracked it. How's she going to prove that? That's a lie. Richard sighed. I don't know yet, but if she manages to convince the judge that your mother was incapable of managing her own assets before the accident, it could complicate everything for us. Leonard felt the world spin. Rhonda was even dirtier than he'd imagined. She was willing to drag Caroline down, destroy her even further, just to keep from losing her fortune. He hung up and walked back into the room where his mother was. Caroline was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing outside. Leonard walked over and gently stroked her grey hair. I'm not going to let you down, Mom, he murmured. That same night, he called Richard and Marcus over to his apartment. They needed to rethink everything. Sitting in the living room, they went over the documents, the testimonies, the recordings. Rhonda's going to try to use everything against us, Richard said. She's going to pay off witnesses, buy fake doctors, drag your mother's name through the mud however she can. Marcus lit a cigarette and blew the smoke out in frustration. That woman's more venomous than a rattlesnake. Leonard ran a hand through his hair. What can we do? Richard thought for a moment. The key is proving Caroline was mentally capable after the accident. Even with memory loss, that doesn't make her legally incapacitated. Marcus sat up straighter. And we've got the medical report from the ranch, the one recommending psychological treatment, not institutionalization. Leonard nodded. And Roger, he can say my mom was talking, asking about me. Richard made a face. It's a risk. Rhonda's lawyer is going to try to tear apart the testimony of a sick old man. Leonard slammed his fist on the table. I don't care, we're going to fight this to the end. Richard looked at him seriously. All right, then get ready, because Rhonda's not going to stop. And worse, he paused. Worse, she might have one more card up her sleeve. Leonard frowned. What do you mean? That your aunt isn't stupid. If she sees she's going to lose everything, she might try one last dirty move. Marcus leaned forward. Like what? Blackmail? Richard shook his head. Something worse. She might bring out secrets you don't even know about yourself. Something that could destroy your credibility. Leonard looked at both of them, feeling alarm bells ringing in his chest. What secrets? Richard sighed. I don't know, but be ready for anything. And it didn't take long for them to find out. 2 days later, while Leonard was at the clinic, he got an unexpected visit. It was Rhonda. She walked in like nothing was wrong, impeccable, elegant, smelling of expensive perfume. Leonard saw her come in and felt his blood run cold. What are you doing here? He snapped. Rhonda smiled, that fake smile that fooled no one anymore. I came to talk to you alone. Leonard glanced at the nurses, watching from the corner of their eyes. He nodded and led Rhonda to an empty room. He closed the door and faced her. What do you want? Rhonda looked at him steadily with that viper-like gaze he knew all too well. I know you're going forward with the lawsuit. I know you've got witnesses and paperwork. Leonard crossed his arms firmly. And I'm not stopping. Rhonda leaned in closer, lowering her voice. Then listen to me carefully, Leo. Because if you keep pushing, I'm going to tell the whole world something you don't know. Leonard didn't answer, just watched her waiting for the blow. Rhonda smiled like someone enjoying crushing an insect. You are not Jack Whitfield's son. Leonard felt the floor open up beneath him. What are you talking about? Rhonda got even closer, until he could almost feel her breath. Your real father is somebody else, somebody far more powerful, somebody you'd never want finding out you exist." Leonard shoved her back, furious. "That's a lie." Rhonda laughed softly like she was enjoying watching him break. "Sure you want to keep digging up the past? Sure you want to open that door?" Leonard stared at her with hatred, more certain than ever. Rhonda looked at him with contempt. "Then get ready to lose everything." She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there alone, shaking with rage and confusion. Leonard clenched his fists until his knuckles ached. Rhonda had just played her last card, and now everything had gotten even more personal. News of the trial spread like wildfire. This wasn't just any case. It wasn't every day that a famous millionaire took his own aunt to court over fraud, breach of trust, and forgery. The media started sniffing around, wanting to know more. Some reporters camped outside the clinic where Caroline was staying. Others posted up outside Richard's office building. Leonard didn't care. He wasn't there to protect his image. He was there to get justice. The day of the trial dawned grey, as if the sky itself knew this wasn't something ordinary. Leonard arrived early at the courthouse wearing a dark suit, no tie. His gaze was steady, though inside he carried a hurricane in his chest. Marcus and Richard were waiting for him at the entrance. The three of them walked through the lobby together, ignoring the cameras and microphones chasing after them. On the other side, as expected, Rhonda arrived. She looked impeccable as always. Designer dress, perfect hair, a defiant look in her eyes. She was accompanied by her lawyer, Stephen Wardell, that shark they'd already investigated. She smiled like this was all just a simple formality. They entered the courtroom. The judge, a serious man of few words, asked everyone to be seated, explained the basic rules, and warned that he wouldn't tolerate interruptions or courtroom drama. Leonard felt his heart pounding in his ears. The district attorney spoke first, laying out the case clearly. Rhonda Whitfield had forged Caroline's death certificate. She had illegally moved the Whitfield family's properties and accounts into her own name. She had committed Caroline to a low-quality nursing home without medical or legal authorization. They presented the original documents, showed Jack Whitfield's will, leaving everything to his wife and son. They laid out the medical report from Palm Ranch, which clearly recommended psychological treatment, not institutionalization. Then the witnesses took the stand. First, the retired nurse, who confirmed that Caroline had not been incapacitated at the time she was handed over to Rhonda. Then the nursing home worker, who remembered a wealthy woman dropping off a confused elderly patient and paying in advance to never come back. And finally, the most important witness, Roger. The old foreman, frail but determined, testified before the judge about everything he'd witnessed the day of the accident. How Caroline had survived, how Rhonda had taken her from the hospital in secret, how she'd ordered him to stay quiet. The courtroom fell completely silent as Roger spoke. Every word he said was like a stone thrown straight at the castle of lies Rhonda had built. When it was the defense's turn, Stephen Wardell tried everything. He tried to discredit Roger, arguing his memory could no longer be trusted. The judge didn't allow it. He tried to introduce falsified medical documents, claiming Caroline suffered from dementia before the accident. Richard stood up fast to object. The judge sustained the objection, refusing to let junk evidence into the record. Stephen looked at Rhonda like he was asking for another card up his sleeve, but she just crossed her arms, her face hardened. Leonard felt like he could barely breathe. He wanted this to be over, but at the same time he wanted to be certain there wasn't a shred of doubt left. When the judge called for closing arguments, Richard spoke on his behalf. In a firm voice, without theatrics, he said, "Today we're not just talking about stolen assets. Today we're talking about a stolen life, a mother torn from her son, a family destroyed by greed. Justice isn't just returning what was stolen. Justice is acknowledging the harm that never should have happened." Leonard looked down, feeling a lump in his throat. Rhonda blinked hard. The judge retired to deliberate. The minutes stretched on forever. Leonard paced back and forth in the waiting room while Marcus tried to distract him with small talk and Richard checked messages on his phone. Finally, after what felt like hours, they were called back into the courtroom. The judge sat down, reviewed some papers, and spoke. His voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. "This court finds sufficient evidence that Ms. Rhonda Whitfield committed fraud, forgery of documents, and breach of fiduciary duty. The court orders the immediate restitution of assets to Mr. Leonard Whitfield and his mother, Caroline Reyes Whitfield. Leonard closed his eyes for a second. They'd done it. But the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court orders a criminal investigation to proceed against Ms. Whitfield for the offences described. The matter is referred to the district attorney's office accordingly. Rhonda's face said it all. All the colour drained from it, and her fake smile vanished like magic. Leonard looked at her one last time. He didn't say anything. There was no need. He'd won, but deep down he knew the hardest battle was just beginning, rebuilding everything Rhonda had destroyed in his life and in his mother's. He walked out of the courtroom and looked up at the sky. It was a new beginning. When they walked out of the courthouse, the mood was like a quiet celebration. Richard and Marcus were smiling faintly, knowing the blow had landed hard and true. Leonard walked beside them, feeling for the first time in a long while like something inside him was settling, like a heavy weight had finally lifted off his shoulders. But it didn't take long for them to realize the whole thing wasn't over yet. Leonard was barely climbing into his truck when he got a call. It was an unknown number. He answered without thinking. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was cold, dry. "Leonard Whitfield. Who's this?" "Someone who has information you need to hear." Leonard gripped the phone. "I'm not in the mood for games. This isn't a game. It's about your father. Your real father." Leonard froze. The voice continued. Rhonda wasn't lying entirely. "Jack Whitfield isn't your biological father, and the real one could change your life more than you can imagine." Before Leonard could ask anything else, the call cut off. He stared at the phone for a few seconds like he expected it to ring again. Marcus, watching him from the passenger door, noticed right away that something was wrong. "What's going on?" Leonard took a deep breath. "Someone claims to have information about my real father." Marcus frowned. "You think it's true?" Leonard put the phone back in his pocket. "I don't know what to believe anymore, but I have to find out." That night in his apartment, Leonard couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk facing the window overlooking the lit-up city, thinking about everything he'd lived through the past few months. He thought about Caroline, about her life, about his own childhood, and now about this bombshell Rhonda had dropped as her final move. What if it was true? What if his entire life had been built on an even bigger lie? At dawn he decided he couldn't sit still. He talked to Richard, asked him to quietly look into everything he could about his mother before the accident. Friends, documents, anything that could give a hint about what Rhonda had insinuated. 2 tense days passed, until Richard showed up at his apartment with an envelope in hand. Leonard opened it without a word. Inside were copies of birth certificates, photographs, letters, and a story. Before marrying Jack Whitfield, Caroline had been in a relationship with another man, a powerful, influential man, from a family that ran businesses touching politics and money at a level Leonard could barely imagine. The name stopped him cold. William Castellan, one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, owner of media companies, construction firms, mining operations. A man with more power than Leonard could fully comprehend. According to the documents, William and Caroline had a serious relationship, but it ended badly under family pressure. Shortly after, Caroline met Jack, who accepted her while she was pregnant and raised the child as his own. Leonard was William Castellan's biological son. He didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or run. Richard watched him in silence, waiting for his reaction. "What does this mean?" Leonard finally asked. "That your real father doesn't even know you exist," Richard said. "For if he does, he's kept it secret all these years." Leonard rested his forehead in his hands. Everything he thought he knew about where he came from was slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Rhonda knew?" he asked suddenly. Richard nodded. "Everything points to yes. It's likely she's been holding this over your head this whole time. That's why she dared to do everything she did. She knew that if things got complicated, she could threaten you with this truth." Leonard let out a bitter laugh. Even in her downfall, she wanted to poison everything. He stayed silent for a long while, staring out at the city. His life had changed forever, not just because of Rhonda's betrayal, not just because of the fight for his mother, but because now he knew part of his blood came from someone who had never once cared about him. Someone who might not even recognize him if he looked him in the eye. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to organize his thoughts. He didn't know if he wanted to meet William Castellan, didn't know if he wanted to open that door. The only thing he was sure of was that at the end of the day, his real family was Caroline. Her, who even broken, even forgotten, never stopped loving him. And that was the only thing that truly mattered. The days after the trial were a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Leonard felt like he'd run a marathon he was only just starting to catch his breath from. All the media noise slowly died down. The newspapers, the social media, the news channels, they all lost interest once they realized there was no scandal of luxury or embarrassing feuds, just a man fighting for his mother. Leonard didn't want to give interviews, didn't want to appear on magazine covers, didn't want to be called a hero. He just wanted his life back. The first big step was getting Caroline out of the clinic, not because they weren't taking good care of her, but because she had asked for it herself. Not with clear words, but through small gestures, small looks. She wanted a home, a real home. Leonard found a beautiful house on the outskirts of the city, a quiet place surrounded by trees, with a big garden where Caroline could spend her afternoons in the sun. He bought it without a second thought. He filled it with comfortable furniture, photos from when he was a kid, soft music, scents his mother might recognize. Moving day felt like a small triumph. Caroline didn't understand everything, but her shy smile at the sight of the garden, the couches, the flowers, was enough for Leonard. He felt like every sleepless night, every fight, every tear had been worth it. They settled in without rushing. He hired a team of specialized nurses to care for her, but he remained her main companion. In the mornings he read her the newspaper, even though she couldn't always follow the news. He told her about his day, his plans, his childhood memories, even when it seemed like he was talking to himself. And sometimes, just sometimes, Caroline would answer with a loose word, a smile, a touch of her hand. They were small moments, but for Leonard, they were everything. The matter of William Castellan hung in the air. Richard had found a discreet way to reach out to him, but Leonard wasn't ready. Not yet. He knew that one day he'd want to know more, want to know who this man was who had given him life, even if he never gave him a hug, a piece of advice, not even his name. But for now, his priority was something else. One weekend, while they were in the garden, Caroline looked at him for a long moment. Leonard was helping her water some plants when he felt her gaze on him. He walked over. "What is it, Mom?" She took a while to answer, as if the words had to travel from somewhere far away to reach her mouth. "Happy?" she asked, almost a whisper. Leonard knelt in front of her. "Yes, Mom, very happy." Caroline smiled. It wasn't just any smile. It was the most sincere smile Leonard had ever seen in his life. They hugged right there under the sun, among the flowers and the smell of wet earth. That moment was worth more than all the millions that had been stolen from him, more than any famous last name, more than any lost inheritance. That was his real victory. Time passed. Caroline had her ups and downs as expected. Some days she remembered more, other days she got lost in her own world again, but she was never alone, never abandoned again. Leonard reorganized his life too. He delegated more work at his company, stepped away from pointless social events, empty parties. He started building something new, something that actually meant something. He reconnected with old friends, supported charities focused on elder care and abandonment, visited other nursing homes where he donated without taking photos or posting anything online. And above all, he built new memories with his mother. Small things, a movie afternoon, a walk in the garden, an improvised breakfast with burnt pancakes. All of it was pure gold to him. One day, walking through the garden, Caroline squeezed his hand. Leonard looked at her. She smiled and said, "My boy." Leonard smiled too, feeling like everything, absolutely everything, had been worth it. The inheritance, the lawsuits, the painful truths, the secrets, all of that was behind him now. Now only one thing mattered, the present. A present where, despite everything, he had achieved what so many people never do, getting back his real family, and with her, his real place in the world. If this story moved you, If you found yourself holding your breath through Leonard's fight for the truth and for his mother, do me a favor and let me know down in the comments. Tell me which part hit you the hardest, and if you believe, like I do, that no amount of money can ever replace a real family. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss the next story. There are so many more waiting for you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.